I want to make a video that's a little different than my normal videos. Most of my videos so far are short and just give little tips of information about RPGs. However, I wanted to make a detailed video on a topic that I'm pretty passionate about. As a result, this one is probably going to be a little longer than normal and might even make you think a little harder. As RPGs have evolved and been refined over time, just like all sources of media, how we go about presenting the RPG has subtly changed. The push for more narrative-heavy games where the game master or leader of the game falls into more the classic role of storyteller is something we're seeing with greater and greater frequency. As a result, the storyline of full campaigns have been more complex, engaging, and exciting. It's less often just kick down the door, slay the bad guy, save the princess. As we are seeing RPG stories become more and more complex that they start rivaling books, TV, and movie stories, I start seeing a tool that could be used in the writing for RPGs that humanity has been using as a storytelling tool for about as long as we've had stories to tell. That tool is known today as the Monomyth. I'm not going to go into the details of when the term monomyth was coined or the history about it. Plenty of other people have already done that. Go ahead, check them out. What I'm going to do is go over the basics of what the monomyth structure is and how we can use it in RPGs. Most of the greatest stories in human history are built upon this formula, and yet we don't find it boring, even after all this time, because we find the setup itself isn't the story, just as the foundation of your skull isn't the final face. Most people have the same parts to their skull, and yet every face is different and feels unique. Almost all of the most critically acclaimed movies of all time are built upon this structure. Terminator 2 Judgment Day, Star Wars A New Hope, The Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, The Silence of the Lambs, Casablanca, Avatar, the list goes on. By using the monomyth structure when writing a complete RPG campaign, I believe the DMs and GMs of our current day games can take their storytelling to some truly epic levels. Firstly, let's get a breakdown of what the standard monomyth setup looks like. There are variations of this, and since we're using this with a collaborative narrative with game elements, we'll even have to make changes a bit as we go. But this is the rough elements of it. I'm going to split the monomyth into stages, steps, and parts. There are 3 stages to the monomyth. The purpose of these stages is to balance how long you spend on the parts of the story, with 25% on the first stage, 50% on the second stage, and 25% on the third stage. Although you can adjust these percentages as you see fit. Each stage encompasses multiple steps, with one of the steps being the threshold between 2 stages. If that sounds confusing, don't worry, just look at the graphic that I have there, the picture, and it should explain it a little easier for you. I won't bother naming the stages or explaining much about why they're balanced this way, because it's really about to be explained during the course of the next 12 steps anyways. There are 12 basic steps to the monomyth. Step 1, the ordinary world. The characters find themselves in their daily activities in what feels like a normal world to them. This doesn't mean their world is normal like ours. It could have flying dragons and wizards, but it is normal every day for them. Step 2, the call to adventure. Something happens that introduces the characters to the fact that there's adventure to be had, and that maybe they're the ones to embark upon it. Step 3, meet the mentor. Classically, it's an old wise man of some kind, like Obi-Wan Kenobi. But a mentor can be anyone that the characters look up to as someone more experienced than them in the situation, but for one reason or another isn't able to resolve the call for adventure themselves. Step 4, refusal of the call. Because you don't have control over the player characters, this is the toughest step to incorporate from the monomyth, and maybe one you'd consider just skipping entirely. One way I've managed to instill reluctance to take the call in the PCs is by showing them that there's a group of more powerful and more experienced characters that are willing to answer the call to adventure and would handle it much better than the PCs would. But then shortly afterwards, for one reason or another, I remove that group so that the responsibility falls back onto the PCs themselves. Step 5, crossing the threshold. This is where we begin to cross from stage 1 to stage 2. It's the first transitional step. During this time, we move from the character's normal world and worldview into the realm of the supernatural. In the case where the character's normal world is that of magic, monsters, spaceships, and aliens, this means moving into a stage where things are really shaken up. Going to other planes of existence, other time periods, other planets, or dramatically changing some aspect about the world around them, introducing them to a broader universe they were previously unaware of. Step 6, tests, allies, and enemies. This is probably one of the largest and longest steps you'll want to focus on. Multiple individual adventures that are part of the greater whole can easily take place during this step. It's where the majority of the supporting cast of NPCs and major villains are probably going to be introduced. This is a good spot to just let the PCs stretch their wings, so to speak. Let them test their abilities and grow in power. This is often the part where you see a training scene, like Luke Skywalker practicing with his lightsaber against the little drone on the ship. Step 7. The Approach. Classically, this was also known as the Belly of the Whale, since that was a fairly commonly used theme at the time. You'll actually see it in multiple stories. If you were to use a more modern scene, it would be the heroes of Star Wars being pulled into the Death Star during A New Hope. This is a good time to give some sort of big reveal that you may have been saving, or to introduce a new major plot device that can really shake things up. Step 8. The Ordeal. Before the heroes manage to escape the belly of the whale, or Step 7, some large confrontation usually occurs. This almost always results in a great loss that has a deep emotional impact upon the heroes. In the case of Star Wars, yet again, it was the death of Obi-Wan Kenobi during the escape and before the major confrontation with Vader. Step 9. The Reward. The heroes use this step to not only escape the belly of the whale, but to take some great reward with them. Something that's a real game changer that gives them a shine of hope to contrast against the great loss that they just suffered in Step 8. The reward is enough that it truly changes them to finally accept that they are the real protagonists of the story, and it empowers them in some way. Step 10. The Road Back. The second transitional stage. This is the voyage for the heroes to try and get back to their regular world in preparation for the final conflict. The voyage itself can sometimes be self-affirming for who they are. Step 11. The Resurrection. The heroes have now actually come back to their regular world, but with a new breath of wisdom, power, experience, or some other fundamental change about them. Their return is usually felt with awe or admiration by those they once left behind. They return newly forged, heroes of power that will have stories and songs crafted about them for generations to come. They, in a sense, have been reborn as something new. And finally, Step 12. Return with the Elixir. The heroes take their reward from Step 9 and use it in the final conflict to its natural conclusion of the story, whether that be good or bad. Nevertheless, this is for the final conflict, and this is them returning and finally solving the story one way or another. Now, there are obviously going to be parts of these 12 steps that you may need to adjust to suit the ever-changing nature of it being an interactive game and not just a normal story. Especially Step 4, the refusal of the call. And it's not like this is the only way to interpret this structure. It's just a foundation for you to build on. A foundation that has been tested for literally thousands of years and has built some of the greatest stories ever told. But wait, there's more. Each step of the Monomyth can also be broken down into 3 individual parts. Part 1. The Primer, or the introduction of the step itself. It's where the initial concept of what that step is about is introduced into the characters. Part 2. The Transformation or Transition. The part of the step that results in something changing about the characters or their perceptions of the world around them. It's really the meat and potatoes of the step. This is the important part of the step and where you want to keep the PCs until they're finally ready for Part 3. And of course, Part 3, the conclusion, where the results of the goals of that particular step are finally reached. Now, I suggest for you to follow these 12 steps as a general guideline for the story, but only worry about the actual specific details, such as your encounters, of the 3 parts of the steps as you actually approach them in-game. This way you can be more reactive to your players' actions and where they have decided to go, while still moving them through the desired story. It helps you from railroading them completely, while still being able to guide them through an engaging story. Here's something I want you to keep in mind about the steps, and the most important part of the steps, the transformation. This is going to sound sort of complex and wordy, but don't worry, I'm going to explain what I've said afterwards. I think it's just important to say it this way because it is one of the more concise ways to state it for those that will understand. What's fairly important is that the entrance to the primer should normally have aspects of similarity to the conclusion. Repetition of aspects and cues to the system help breed familiarity. Familiarity helps people to feel more connected and understanding. You cannot easily recognize transformation without similarity of context. Also, duality of similarities allows for a broad spectrum of extremes to help solidify both transformations and archetypes in the mind. So by referencing the pre-transformation aspects to the post-transformation aspects and pushing the duality between them, you help emphasize the transformation while solidifying the familiarity of the situation. Okay, what the hell did I just say? Let's pick that apart, shall we? This reference is an idea I put forth when trying to get your players attached to NPCs emotionally. The best way to get a person to become attached is through repetition, to make the person feel familiar with the subject at hand by introducing the subject over and over. When a person starts to feel familiar with something, they feel as if it's partly theirs now, and they really grab onto it because people like things that are theirs. This is why fan communities often see their members become stronger and stronger fans over time. It's not just because the fans like the content. It's partly because they have now interacted with the content with enough frequency that it has gained a sense of familiarity to them. In a sense, the content has become a part of the identity of the person. People are protective and very attached with their identities. Thus, they become attached to those things that they have an intimate familiarity with. So when you start and end a step with the primer and the conclusion parts that I talked about earlier, the way to make players feel really attached to what happened in that step is to make it end in a very similar way to how it began. For example, say you're in step 10, the road back. By having the players enter through a particular looking archway that leads into the deadly maze, or let them physically walk out of hell and back into the normal mortal world. At the conclusion of step 10, have them exit through a very similar but opposing archway to help them tie it in. Instead of gnarled and twisted, it's rigid and bright. Both should be roughly the same size and shape. On one side it could be inscriptions in Infernal, and the other side it could be the common tongue of your world. But both say the same thing. It seems like a minor detail, especially if that step just took you like 5 or more play sessions to achieve and then you only spend a few seconds describing the archways. But by putting something that is both similar and opposite, the player's subconscious will automatically grab onto it. It will become an aspect that is both familiar and comforting, but also shows the mind that a transformation or change has happened, and also the familiarity of having a repeating thing. Let's look at Terminator 2 for a moment. Something you may or may not have noticed is the act of dropping something and then it getting stepped on. When John Connor first meets the Terminator, he's transitioning from being a carefree child to a more mature military adult that he is destined to be. To show this, the Terminator is carrying roses that he drops to reveal a shotgun. He then steps on those roses as the first major fight with the T-1000 begins, and John is transitioned to a new part of his life. The roses represent his innocence being crushed by the reality around him. You may think, well, that couldn't have been planned, that was just, a neat little effect that he put in for no reason. But no, this is actually a reoccurring theme throughout the movie. Let's look at the next part. When Sarah Connor first meets the Terminator, he's wearing sunglasses. This brings her back to the days of him being a cold, humanless killing machine. The glasses are hiding his humanity. During the course of the scene, his glasses are dropped and his very human eyes are revealed. As the Terminator protects Sarah and John from a hail of bullets, the T-1000 steps on the glasses. This crushes the past conceptions of the Terminator being a cold machine, and he is now the protective figure of the story. All of that information is told just by dropping a couple of objects and stepping on them. Yet it has become familiar and meaningful by the second time it happens just because of its repetition and its nature of opposition and change. It's something you may not even have fully consciously noticed until now, but it is something at least your subconscious mind has picked up. To say it again so it firmly implants itself into your mind, repeating something in a story, but maybe in a slightly different way, helps to breed familiarity, which people use to make the story a part of themselves. One of the most important aspects of this is the nature of duality. Although we love complex stories or shades of gray of morality and complex plots that make you think, even those complex plots still have many parts that are very black and white. The reason is that extreme duality helps the human mind sort things out, even if the universe isn't always set up that way. The human mind is built to try and categorize things often into dual natures: hot, cold, light, dark, up, down, safe, dangerous. It's just one of those things our brain automatically likes to do. So even if you have a brilliantly crafted complex story, there's some things you'll always want to have as part of this dual nature. This is because it's hard for the human being to recognize transition or transformation without the duality. It's hard for us to recognize the change unless we can see the difference between the start and the finish. So having some duality in your primer and conclusion parts helps to really make the transformation part really stand out, even if the rest of the story is complex or more shades of gray. For example, that maze out of hell that I mentioned. Even if the maze itself was complex and brought up a lot of questions of deeper meaning and everything about the characters, just having the entrance and exit being opposing dualities is enough for the mind of the players to recognize the transition that the step was meant to convey. The road back. So I've gone through a ton of information here on the Monomyth and how you'd go out setting it up in an RPG campaign. And when I say campaign, I mean one of those long stories told over many play sessions involving several adventures or smaller story arcs. Although you could technically use the same structure for a single adventure, and I kinda have seen it done so, I find to get the most out of the Monomyth, it's really best to use for those longer reaching campaigns. Also, don't forget the conclusion of the Monomyth doesn't mean that's the complete end of the story for those heroes. Star Wars: A New Hope follows the Monomyth structure completely from beginning to end, but as you may have noticed, there's still a few movies afterwards, most of which also follow the Monomyth formula, for better or for worse. So my goal here wasn't to give you a strict set of rules to make your own campaigns. There's lots of ways to write stories and to write campaigns in many different play styles. I only wanted you to think about how you want to present your story to your players when writing and what you want to do with it, specifically about a writing style that's existed for so long and has done so many great stories for us in the past. And remember, for ease of use when writing a campaign, keep things as modular as possible when it comes to specific encounters. The Monomyth is just there to create an overreaching storyline that blankets the campaign. The individual bits underneath, such as the actual route traveled and encounters used, are easiest to set up if you make them modular in nature. I've touched upon this in a previous video about encounter creation before. You should probably check it out to see if there's any more tips for it. Trust me, it's worth it. Now, I know this has been a much longer video than normal, and I hope at least a few of you have been willing to sit through it. But I honestly think if more GMs spent a little time looking up some of the brilliant writing techniques people have been using throughout time, that we can truly make some stories that are going to inspire emotions that even the greatest of books and movies throughout time have a hard time accomplishing. So, keep rolling, keep writing, and have a good one, eh?